Now, you absolutely have to understand that this was not a reverie or a dream. Nothing like that at all. I was there. I was back in time 22 years, inhabiting my younger body, talking to my sister in the living room of my father's house. Full color, stereo sound, the works. I said, holy shit. And my knees gave way and I had to lie down on the couch. And Harris was all over me about what had happened. It was hard to reply at first. It wasn't that I felt drugged or dull or extra sharp, like on coke or speed, but more detached, a very subtle variation in consciousness. And there was a beating in my head, a pulse like a kitten licking my brain 4 or 5 times a second. Thnick, 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 in just that delicate way. At the same time, I felt both extremely focused and detached, as if experiencing my life for the first time without the blurring of worry and regret. Not in the least like hash, and the furthest thing from acid. She asked me a bunch of questions she read off a printed sheet, and I answered them as best I could. Yes, I attended my father's funeral. No, I can't guarantee that what I experienced was a memory and not a fantasy. It seemed perfectly real, just like talking right then to the silly woman seemed real. Although if you informed me that I was still in my room on the night of the funeral and that this interview was a fantasy, I would have said sure, right. She kept me for another hour. The kitten licking faded after a while, and I returned more or less to normal, although at that point I was no longer sure what normal was. On the way out, I lifted from the reception room table a tattered old People magazine with a story about Madonna in it. Back at the loft, I set up a small gessoed wood panel and dug through the chests until I found an old theatrical costume that would do, plum-colored, with gilt threads and a straight high bodice. Some Juliet must have worn it in the Edwardian age. Stank of mothballs, but in good shape. I hung it on my mannequin, propped her in an armchair, arranged the lighting, pinned Madonna's face up on the wall nearby, and got to work. I drew it out in charcoal, a figure from the waist up, with her arms demurely folded, pale hair in ringlets falling to the neck, showing against a cloudy background, and a little city with walls and towers back there. Underpainting in warm gray ochre, mixed a little Japan dryer in because I'm a commercial artist, can't wait for the paint to dry, and who cares if it cracks and blackens in 50 years. So when the imprimatura was touched dry, I built up the masses, laid on glazes, and then the fall of the drapery, and it went terrific. I painted for hours. It got dark outside. I got hungry. I ignored the phone ringing. Was it different? I guess. I can often get lost in the act of painting and forget for a while that what I'm doing is essentially commercial crap, but this session was even more so. I was totally into it, with my body just letting the paint flow out onto the fresh white surface. Magic. My stomach was growling by then, and I wanted to give the underpaint a chance to dry, so I took a break and walked over to Chinatown for some noodles, and took the People with me to read and study Madonna some more. Her face in the cheap printing showed the mere mask of the celebrity, and the job was to find the interior behind it. And of course you can't do that from a photo, that's the point. The handlers want to control the star's image. Revelation not wanted. So I knew I'd have to imagine it. And naturally I thought about Suzanne, a singer at a vastly lower level of celebrity but a face I knew well, and I worked with that. The People photo was a typical lowering Madonna shot, the overbit mouth pouting and a little downturned, the eyelids at half-mast in a way meant to be read as sexual, according to the conventions of beauty shots. When I got back to my place, I opened her mouth into a little gape of astonishment and put into her eyes the deep loneliness and insecurity of the famous performer, and the not-so-famous, as I knew from experience, and the Bambino. They hadn't asked for one, but I thought it added the right touch. So I pulled out an old baby picture of Milo and painted it in freehand. Milo had a kind of sly expression, you know the kind, the secret and unknowable joy of the pre-articulate child. I glazed the underpainting all night, and when I looked at it by daylight, it was certainly a credible Leonardo. No sharp outlines, everything smoky. Sfumato, they called it. And the background is pretty good. I threw in some of those flat-looking Quattrocento trees, which I always thought were an artistic convention until I went to Italy and saw they had taken them from life. I never learned what kind of trees they were. I always called them Quattrocento trees. Amazing, really. I would have futzed around with something like this for weeks. And so if Shelley thought the drug enhances creativity, I have to say, yeah, it does. And it got better. I did 5 paintings in 5 days. By far the most productive period of my life. I mean, without coke and speed. And it was nothing like the frenzy I used to have when I was drugged out. It was just like, shit, I can't say what it's like. Being super normal, maybe. Not getting distracted. Total focus. Total pleasure in the work. When I was 4, or around there, I could sit forever in my father's studio while he worked, with big sheets of newsprint on the floor, drawing with my crayons or painting with watercolors. Time stopped, or flowed at a different pace, and there was nothing but the moment before I made a mark, and the making the mark, and looking at the mark afterward. And again. That week was just like that. For some reason, all the shit that usually runs through my brain, worries about money, about the wives and kids, about what I'm doing, all seemed to take a little vacation, leaving a stripped-down Chaz who just painted. Wonderful. A couple of days later, I went back to the med school for another session. They took a blood sample, and I got a quick physical. I told them I felt fine. Great, in fact. Even if I did lose almost 10 pounds, and I had to fill out a form about how I fared the past week. Interesting, the stuff they were checking on. Paranoid ideation, sleepwalking, violence, convulsions, catatonia, hallucinations, uncontrollable laughter, excessive urination, no urination at all, reverse ejaculation, eating unfamiliar foods, priapism, impotence, paralysis, dyskinesia, and there's a section for changes in creative process, where you can rate your creative functioning on scales of 1 to 10, and I gave myself all 10s. Unless that was a hallucination. How could you tell? Then the same little room with Harris. She said, we're going to try a slightly lower dose, and she hooked me up to various meters, including a brainwave device. Chewed my wad. Same as before, 1 second I'm in the little room, the next I smell the cologne my mother always used back when she was alive, Lily of the Valley, and I'm in her lap, on our deck, looking over the Sound. A gray day, it must be early autumn, and she has me wrapped in a brown velvet throw. Charlie is away somewhere, and Mother's lovely, and I am perfectly happy. She's telling me a story, always the same story, about the brave little boy whose mother is kidnapped by an ogre and taken to his castle. But the brave little boy fights through many dangers and drives the ogre out of the castle, and the brave little boy and his mother live happily ever after in the ogre's castle. Okay, the same as before. I'm there, it's real, and now something happened that was even more weird. I'm sitting in her lap, and then the scene darkens, and the smell of the water and of her perfume fade, and they're replaced by heavier smells, meat cooking, and scorched feathers, and a sweet, sour smell like sewage and lavender fighting it out, and I'm on a woman's lap, but it's not my mother. And I'm not me. But I also know she's my mother, and I'm also me in a strange way, as if the 2 little boys are the same boy, both the same age, one on a deck overlooking Long Island Sound, and the other in his room. A familiar room, familiar comforting sounds and smells. My mother is wearing a black velvet dress that smells of lavender, and there are other women in the room moving about, and my mother is talking to them, discussing domestic affairs, how to cook a chicken, the need for more beans. I am wearing a dress, too, of some stiff fabric, blood red, with a lace collar. The room is small, with a low-beamed ceiling, and dim. The light comes through a narrow casement window made of round lens-like panes. My mother puts me off her lap and stands, and another woman grabs me by the hand and leads me out of the room into a courtyard flooded with strong light. Overhead is the hot sky of some southern region. This, too, is all familiar. A fountain lined with blue tiles playing in the center of the courtyard, and I am fascinated by this blue and how the water changes the color of it. I splash my hand in the water, and the sensation is real, actual. I look at the blue of the tiles and the blue of the sky, and I think that this has some importance, but I don't know what it is. From outside I hear the noises of the street, vendors' cries, and the snort of horses and creak of cartwheels. A dark-skinned woman comes in through the gate with baskets of flowers, red carnations. I stare at the flowers, and I conceive a desire for them. I want to hold the perfect red of them. But someone shouts, and the flower woman darts away and does not latch the gate. And I slip out into the street, although I have been warned not to, warned the Jews will steal me. I follow the flower lady through narrow streets. She knocks at doors, enters, or is shouted away. While I wait, I play with a stick. I poke a dead cat into the sewer that runs down the center of the street. I am careful with my shoes. I'm not to get them wet with the filth.